What are the biggest questions the 2023 Utah football team will have to answer during the 2023 season? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege, and they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. My name is Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about the biggest questions heading into the 2023 Utah football season. And in order to help us do that, it's the voice of the Utes, Bill Riley, joining us today. And Bill, I think when you're talking about the biggest questions heading into the 2023 season, this is the biggest thing I've seen for reasons Utah has not been ranked on some preseason rankings I've seen, or just in general, certain players have been kind of lower than I think they normally would be in terms of positional rankings. And that is the health of Cam Rising and Brant Kuithe in general. I think those will be the biggest questions and the reason people have kind of stipulations about Utah going into the season about their availability. Now, everything we've heard, and including your own colleague Porter Larson has come on this show and even stated Cam is going to play. We heard recently too, Cam even responded to someone's tweet implying his recovery wasn't going well, kind of even saying that's news to me. So it seems like Cam and Brant are on track to go, but until we officially see them during fall camp, that will be the biggest question I think everyone has.
Well, yeah, but they both have said it. They both said it on my radio show. In fact, Cam said it about a month ago when he sat in studio with me and said, I'll be in fall camp and I'm going to start against Florida. And then Brant was on my radio show last week and he said, I'm on course. I just need to get the final clearance from the doctor and I'll be ready to go for fall camp. So, I mean, I understand when people on the outside, JT, say stuff like that. I mean, I really do, because until you see it, they're both coming off ACL injuries. You don't know. But when you talk to them and you hear from their medical people that everything's on track and maybe that they're ahead of schedule, that's good news. Could there be setbacks? Sure, there could. But both these guys are far enough along in their rehab now that if there was going to be a setback, it probably would have had, especially with Kuithe. Kuithe's almost 9 months now removed from his injury. Cam's about 6.5 months removed from his. So if there were going to be any major setbacks, they probably would have happened by now. But I get that part of it. I mean, I get when people on the outside don't know, because let's face it, you're talking about the quarterback, the most important position on the field, and arguably the best offensive weapon coming back too. So without certainty, without seeing those guys, I can understand some skepticism from the outside.
Yeah, but as you mentioned too, I mean, I would much rather trust those guys, what they say, rather than random things we hear on Twitter and these other things as well. So definitely seems like they're going to be on track. So assuming, and what's more than likely going to happen, as we said, those guys are going to be out there. I think for the next biggest question, I know for me, this one, I don't think this one gets brought up by as many people. I hear a lot of people talk about the corners and receivers, and we can dive into some of those concerns. To me, it's the left tackle spot, because when you're talking about the best players this Utah football team has to replace last year, you look at a Clark Phillips, it's like, well, okay, you got your other two top corners returning. You got a guy in Miles Battle coming over as well. You got some young freshmen, and it's a little easier to contribute early on as a freshman corner than it is as like a Spencer Fano stepping in on offensive line. That's not something that's really going to happen this year. And then obviously Dalton Kincaid departs. Well, you have Brant Kuithe back. That's about as good of a transition as it's going to be. But I do think the left tackle spot, it sounds like, just based on everything we heard during spring camp, it's going to be Falcon Kaumatule. Slim chance it could still be Satao Laumea. We've seen some shuffling late in the offensive line once they get into kind of the fall camp portion of their wrap-up portion to the season. But it seems like it's going to be Falcon Kaumatule. I like what we've seen from Falcon. He's got all the size, all the tools and intangibles. I trust Jim Harding, but I just think until we see him out there, I think that's going to be my biggest question, because that's obviously an extremely important spot. And part of the reason Cam has been so effective is Bam Olaseni and Braden Daniels have really held it down on the left side.
Well, and you're right. Again, it's kind of going back to what we said in that first question about the offseason too, is until you actually see it, you don't know. Falcon's only been a spot starter for Utah. He got a lot of reps in the spring, but he's never started at left tackle, and he's been a spot guy on the right-hand side. So I understand that skepticism, but remember, Bamidele Olaseni never played on the left-hand side, and he got basically placed in the lineup and then taken out of the lineup again, and it wasn't until fall camp of his last year that he actually secured that. I think you're right in believing in Jim Harding, but again, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of skepticism or a little bit of questioning until you actually see it in action. And the left, the left tackle is the blind side. it's the most important position on that offensive line. Well, you could make a case for center maybe too, but until you see Falcon go in there and do it, that's fair. And we've seen this in recent years too. There have been guys that have started and then by midway through the first game or the second game, maybe they were subbed out. The good news, as you pointed out, is Sataoa Laumea's got a lot of starts under his belt. He's played a little bit of right tackle. I think that shift over to left tackle might not be a bad thing if he had to do it. But Falcon's going to get his shot. And I asked Cam when he was on my show a month ago about the offensive line, and he felt good about not just the 5 guys that they've penciled in as starters. He felt good about 7 or 8 guys. So I think there's good depth on that line. But again, first-time starter at the left tackle spot. Until you see it in game, you can run as many scrimmages and practices as you want, but until you line up against what should be a pretty good and athletic defensive front for Florida, you just won't know.
No, absolutely. And you make a great point too. Just talk about the depth. That's something we've heard Coach Harding, Coach Whittingham, you mentioned Cam even bringing it up on your show as well, talk about. And it's been a nice plus for this Utah football team whenever there is an injury. The last few years, like Nick Ford, I remember he goes down. Paul Miley steps in, does a really good job. Last year, Paul Miley gets hurt. Johnny Maea does a good job. And even Maea went down a little bit, so you had to roll on to the next guy. And it's always just continue to do their job. There hasn't really been an issue up front. So I do think they will be good up there. And it's still nice that you do return 3 starters overall, even though you get Paul transferring to BYU, but you got guys all over the place who do have that starting experience, with the exception of that being a Falcon. But I am curious, Bill, what is your biggest kind of question you have about this team heading into the season?
Well, I've got a little, you were mentioning it a minute ago. I've got a little bit of a question about corner. Who's going to start? I feel like you've got 2 guys that have some experience out there in Broughton and in Zamiah Vaughn, but where does Miles Battle factor in all this thing? The transfer in from Ole Miss, and do either of the 2 outstanding freshmen, either Smith Snowden or CJ Blocker, factor in there at all too? So those are some questions that I have as well about the corner spot, because really for the last 6 years, last 2 cycles, Utah's had a lockdown guy, either a Jalen Johnson or a Clark Phillips, who started from day one as freshmen. And again, those guys didn't have experience coming in, but they were known commodities. They knew from the jump they were going to be starters. So I'm going to be very curious to see how they rotate those corners around and who slides in at the nickel spot too. Is it going to be a guy like Elijah Davis? Do they play the 3 safety look and have Sione Vaki play a little bit of that nickel? Does one of those freshmen, maybe a Smith Snowden or a CJ Blocker, step in and play nickel too? So it's not concern necessarily. It's just curiosity and questions to see how Sharif, Sean, Morgan, Scally move those corners around.
Yeah, 100%. Because of where the depth is at there, I think you don't really feel worried about it, because you have, as you mentioned, Vaughn, who's been here a while, and last year led Utah in passes deflected, actually, just because people especially after the Oregon State game, realized, hey, I don't really want to throw out that Clark Phillips guy. Like, it doesn't usually go well after that. We know Broughton, coming back from recovery the previous year. This year, it's all just training. So I expect him to be even stronger. Battle's got a ton of SEC experience, and just, going out there and watching some of the practices just looks the part of a corner, right? Long, rangy guy who's had to battle against, no pun intended, even just against some of the best receivers we've seen, not just in college football, but not just in the SEC, but in college football in general. So I think that's something that's really exciting for this group as well. You mentioned the influx of young talent too coming in, and it's going to be really interesting to see what we get from the corner spot on this Utah football team, because they got a lot of guys who can step up, and it'll be interesting to see who they roll with, because as you mentioned too, guys emerged like a Sione Vaki last season, and it seems like he'll be needed a lot at that safety spot. So we will be very interesting to see what happens with the corner spot. And there's still a few other questions we have to answer with this Utah football team. Or what were you going to say, Bill?
No, I was going to ask you, to me, another question is the wide receiver room. Are you curious to see how that wide receiver room pans out? Because to me, they've got 2 proven commodities. And I'm going to count Brant Kuithe as 1 foot in the receiver room, 1 foot in the tight end room. He's not completely one or the other. But to me, the only real proven Utah commodities we have are Devon Vele and Money Parks. But we've got this influx of new guys. Micah Pittman's coming in. The Simmons kid from Indiana is coming in. Mikey Matthews is still a newbie. I mean, we saw him in the spring, but he doesn't have any real game experience yet. So I think there's a lot of options and weapons. And I'm also, does a Makai Cope step forward and take a step this year? Does Ambassador maybe make a step this fall? Because I know in fall camp before he got hurt last year, he was impressing some people, including Cam Rising. So to me, the hierarchy more of the wide receiver room is what's interesting to me. We know who a lot of the names are, but what's the hierarchy look like? I think Brant Kuithe is probably going to be option number 1. Yeah. But how does it fall after that? Is it Vele? Is it Parks? Do one of the new guys step in? how does that wide receiver room look? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that too. And we're going to continue to talk about actually that in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys a little bit more about our friends at Birddogs. Birddogs stretchy khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look. Birddog shorts do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They fit way better than regular shorts. Those regular shorts are made of a stiff, restricting cotton. Birddogs fix this issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khakis, but stretches, so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs use stink, sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. Guys, I wear Birddogs all the time to record this podcast, go on a walk with friends as well, or just take my dog for a walk, hanging out with family, going to barbecues or different things. They're the perfect shorts for summertime and just for any time. They've become my pair of shorts in just the short time I've had them, and they can become your pair of shorts choice as well, because you can go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off, we promise you. So, Bill, you were talking about the wide receiver position, and I agree. It's kind of the similar thing to the corner where you like the pieces that are there, but there's a lot to be determined. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And Brant Kuithe is going to be the guy when it comes to catching passes for this Utah football team too. And even with the tight ends, I'm kind of curious to see. I expect Thomas Yasmin to be the second guy. I think it'd be surprising if he wasn't, but I do think Landon King can do some nice things. So I'm excited to see how he works into things too. And then I think Miki Sugaturaga is going to be a really interesting Logan Kendall replacement as well. But specifically with those receivers on the outside, and when I ask people in general, like kind of what their questions are about Utah football, it is kind of who's going to be the second and third guy, because we know what Devon Vele did last year and the kind of potential he showed. And I think another year with him and Cam Rising together, I think their rapport is only going to be even stronger. I'm really excited to see Money Parks. I think Money Parks, everyone goes back to the USC game, but even the first game against USC, Bill, I know you remember that huge 49-yard catch he had to set Utah up on the 1-yard line that really sparked that momentous comeback that they ended up having. So I'm excited to see a Micah Pittman too. We know he's recovering from everything, but yeah, I feel like right now it's probably going to be in some combination of Vele and Parks. And because we see so much of the two tight ends too, that's where it's interesting to see. But I do love that you brought up Emory Simmons. I feel like everyone forgets about him just because Pittman is kind of the newer transfer you've gotten, even though Simmons hasn't even gotten with the team yet. He's a guy who still put up 400 yards in the Big Ten last season for Indiana. So I think he's going to be a really strong addition as well. But it sounds like you're in a similar boat, right? You feel good about the receivers this team has. You're just interested to see kind of who ends up coming and emerging as the season goes on. And even the guy you highlighted, Mikey Matthews, showed a lot of potential too. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that we're going to have a 75 or 80 catch receiver. I'm not sure anybody goes for 1,000 yards, but that's not really how this offense is constructed. You might have Brant Kuithe catch 70 passes. You might have Devon Vele catch 50, Micah Pittman catch 45, Mikey Matthews catch 30. I think it's going to be distributed. We haven't even talked about obviously Thomas Yasmin's going to be a big part of this as well as the number one tight end. But I think the way this offense is constructed, it's not constructed for a guy to go for 1,500 or 1,800 yards because you're balanced. You're going to run the football, and they like to spread the football around. That's one of the secret sauces. You're not able to focus on one particular offensive weapon for Utah. I like the room a lot. And one note on Micah Pittman, too. He and Cam Rising have been friends since Pee Wee football. Oh. They've known each other. In fact, Cam tried when he left Oregon to go to Florida State. Cam tried to get him to come to Utah then. And he went to Florida State. So Cam and he have had a relationship that dates back to their childhood, and it wouldn't surprise me at all. In fact, I asked Cam, I said, "You're gonna have a lot of new weapons, and you're a little beat up. You're not full strength quite yet. How long will it take you to get on the same page as your wide receivers?" He kind of winked at me and said, "Give me a weekend." So he's pretty confident he can get those guys on the same page. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if Micah Pittman didn't end up developing into one of his go-to guys.
Trust is such a big thing between quarterbacks and receivers. And you mentioned that trust between Pittman, even though they haven't played together the last couple of years, is something that's been building for a very long time. So I definitely think those two are going to hook up for a few big third down conversions. And I definitely think he will be a welcome addition to the team overall. So we talked about the corners. I think another question I have, Bill, is just the pass rush as well. I think I like some of the guys that they brought in are coming in. One guy in particular I'm just excited to see get on the field a little bit is a Logan Fano. This is a guy who's a 4-star going to BYU. His last full season, of course, it was high school football, so he's not going to come into college and do that. But he's a guy who had 20 sacks still playing at Timpview, so very competitive, high-level high school football. I think he's a guy who can come in, as I said, recovering from the injury. I don't know what to expect from him in the first year. I think he will see the field a little bit, but I think eventually could grow into elite pass rusher. We know Chase Kennedy as well. Jonah Ellis really started to come on as the season wore down. I'm excited to see him with another year with this group as well, Van Fillinger. So I feel good about the depth in the defensive end room. And I should mention Connor O'Toole. So, because Connor O'Toole is the definition of in-season development to me. When you look back at the level he was playing at in the Florida game versus to where he was at by the end of the season, I think he's a guy who could be a huge part of this too. So
he's my breakout player this year.
Oh, really?
Okay. On the radio show, I think Connor O'Toole is a guy that might lead Utah in sacks this year. I think he's going to have a breakout year. If you watch the way he played down the stretch in the last couple of games in the Pac-12 championship game, he was just learning to play that position. Yes. He made the move from wide receiver. He was just getting comfortable with that extra 35 or 40 pounds on his frame, and he still has that speed. I think you're going to see this team. Maybe somebody doesn't get a 15-sack season like a Bradley and I or a Nate Orchard did, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to see 4 or 5 guys between 5 and 11 sacks. I think you could see a bunch of guys with good sack numbers. Hell, Van Fillinger was having a good year before he got hurt. You mentioned Jonah Ellis. I think this is a year where Morgan Scalley's not going to have to game it up a ton. I think he's going to be able to generate a lot of pressure with that front 4 and keep those guys fresh. You've got 6 guys at defensive end and 5, maybe 6 guys at defensive tackle. When Utah's always been at its best, JT, is when they've just rotated guys through and kept fresh bodies in there. I think they're going to be able to do that. You mentioned Chase Kennedy. I was talking to Nate Orchard, former mayor of Sac Lake City, and he said he loves Chase Kennedy. In fact, he's been working a little bit with Chase Kennedy on the side, and he said he thinks Kennedy's got all the tools. Now, Chase may be a kind of a specialist this year. He may not be a 3-down guy this year. Maybe you use him in pass rush situations because you've got so much depth. But the one thing Utah has on that edge is speed. They have all those guys are anywhere between about 6'3" and 6'4" and about 240 to 245 pounds. They're not those big, bulky defensive ends. They're those guys that generate and use that athleticism and speed. And I really do think this is going to be a year. And then inside with guys like Pepa and Junior Tafuna, and the names are now escaping me.
By Mahi, just a loaded group of guys.
Aliki there, and then some others. I think they're going to be able to generate some push in the middle, but those guys on the outside are going to do it. I really think this is a year where that old mantra of Sac Lake City might come back.
That will be a welcome thing as well, because Bill, as you know, the Pac-12 is pretty loaded when it comes to quarterbacks, so it'll definitely be a good thing to get after them. Honestly, Bill, those for me were kind of the biggest questions I had. Was there anything we haven't hit yet that you think is important when you talk about questions for this team?
A little bit on the return game. Just simply because I think the place kicking is going to be good. Cole Becker was a solid to above average kicker at Colorado. And I think the punt game came on a little bit toward the end of the year last year. But my question was in the return game. And I think you may see some other options besides maybe, I don't know, maybe Devon's the guy again. But I'm curious if they can kind of get back to where they were a couple of years ago, where they were a little bit more explosive in the return game, not so much the kick return game, because that's hard to do. And when you've got a good offense, there's nothing wrong with taking that ball at the 25-yard line and just calling it good. But in the punt return game with Kuithe, it was such a nice weapon to be able to flip fields. I'm curious if they've got somebody in there besides Devon that they might try out this fall as a punt returner and leave Devon to be maybe just not that he was bad. I mean, he was solid. He had great hands, but he wasn't necessarily that explosive return man that you had with a guy like Kuithe. Or even going back, a guy like Boobie Hobbs or some of those other guys. Do they have one of those guys? And I know Micah Pittman's done it in the past. He's been a return guy. Is there somebody that might be able to be maybe a touch more explosive? Or maybe Kyle's just happy with having the safe hands, catching that ball and turning the ball over to the offense, which has been as efficient and as effective as it's been in his entire tenure.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head to me, right? Like Vele, although he didn't have any touchdowns last year, did not turn the ball over. And that is by far the most important thing, especially when you're playing for a defensive coach. But Pittman's done it and had some success with it as well. No like game-changing Kuithe type plays, but still showed the potential to potentially break one. So it will be interesting to see. And I definitely think that's a position we could potentially see some change at this season. Just if you feel good about the other guys that are there, since you already got the sure-handed guy in Devon Vele. And Bill, when you're talking about last season, unfortunately, we didn't have any return touchdowns at all. So you didn't get a chance to call any of those. Like you were spoiled with Britton Kuithe, as you kind of mentioned, got some pretty good ones there. But I am curious, what were your favorite moments to call last season?
I mean, I could pick from the 2 USC games,
Yeah.
probably 15 moments. It's funny you mentioned that, JT, because last weekend I was just jonesing for a little football, and they were on the DVR, so I went back and watched those games, and both of them. I mean, the game at Rice-Eccles in mid-October, there were so many great moments in that game, good and bad, big plays galore all over the place, and in the game of the Pac-12 championship game too, and some of my favorite plays too. And I was, just kind of going back to what we were talking about. We've talked so much about the offseason questions about Utah's offense with, Rising's health and Kuithe's health and stuff like that. I think we've ignored the fact that this defense could be really good this year. And I went back looking at some of those plays last year, and the defense came up with some gigantic plays, some big sacks, just plays that stand out to me. Obviously, the goal line plays, both the go-ahead or the tying touchdown and the 2-point conversion that Cam Rising got. And again, the shaking. I mean, my booth is shaking. We can feel that in the press box. I mean, it's just the place is going bananas. In the Pac-12 championship game, Jaquindon Jackson breaking through the hole and then stiff-arming Bullock, the safety at the goal line. Heck, I could pick 2 or 3 of Thomas Yasmin's touchdowns because it felt like every one of Thomas Yasmin's touchdowns last year, he's rumbling down the field and stiff-arming and hurdling and doing all that stuff. Yasmin had a bunch of great plays last year too. So, and I'll say it too, Rising, that play where he got his helmet knocked off in the Pac-12 championship game was amazing because he gets decapitated and then he pops right back up again and just smiles at the USC defenders and then gets right back. Well, he had to go out of the game for a play, but got right back at it again. So it was one of those years where it was so up and down. Like the Florida game had some great moments, but then it had some not so great moments too. I would say that touchdown too that Dalton Kincaid caught in the back of the end zone against Colorado, where he went up, adjusted his body, twisted and contorted. I mean, that was ultimately the play that kind of did in his season. That was the play he got really injured on. He wasn't quite the same after that, but that catch alone was phenomenal.
Yeah, there's so many great moments. I love that you brought up the 2-point conversion. So for me, I've been in the press box for the past few years, just doing different various things in the athletic department, but I go back to Covey's return. I was in the box, so I felt it shaking. This last year, I was lucky enough to be on the field when the 2-point conversion, when Cam powers it in. It was just one of those moments, to your point, where you're like, this is a special moment. How loud Rice-Eccles Stadium was rocking. It was just spectacular. I mean, it's one of those moments of like, this is why I love this sport in this game, because just everyone losing their minds collectively together. Such an unbelievable moment too. And you're right. Last year was a crazy year where you have so many amazing moments like that too. And I even go back, you just mentioned the potential you have from watching that USC game of what this defense could be and the flashes they showed. Cause you mentioned the Florida game. Like it's unfortunate that, look, this is the way it's going to work, right? Like you're going to play those non-conference teams early on in the season. I feel like if that Utah defense, the way they were playing at the end of the season, had played that way when they saw Florida early on, that could have been a much different game, because you look back at some of those crazy plays Anthony Richardson made, and I just don't think the Utah defense allows some of those type plays by then. So I'm really excited to see what this defense could do this coming season. And Bill, it feels like it'll be a season with a lot more memorable calls with what it's shaping up to be, and some special games with some of the games on the schedule.
The schedule's unbelievable. I've been lucky enough to be doing this for 15 years. I don't think Utah's ever played a better schedule than what they have this year. Florida and Baylor to open the season, the 9 conference games against all the teams that are going to be ranked in the conference this year, some big home games, some huge away games, the Coliseum, Husky Stadium, McLean Stadium at Baylor, then, UCLA coming here. The game at Oregon State, I think, is a hidden gem. Wistrcill Stadium, fully renovated. That Friday night game, the Beavs are going to be amped up for that. There's so many great potential moments on the schedule ahead. I get excited when I think about what this season could possibly be.
And unfortunately, it's still a little over 2 months away, but Bill, it is getting a little closer. So where should people head over if they want some more Utah football talk?
Well, you can always head over to my show. I'm on 11 to 2, Monday through Friday on ESPN 700. And then, of course, on game days, same place with Scott Mitchell and Stevenson Sylvester. We're excited about the season coming up. That 6 o'clock kickoff against Florida at Rice-Eccles Stadium on August 31st will kick it all off. Pac-12 Media Day coming up on July 21st. That'll be interesting to see where Utah is placed in the hierarchy of teams by the Pac-12 media. But, that's where you can find me.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure you guys give Bill a follow on Twitter as well, at ESPN 700 Bill. Bill, appreciate you joining us.
JT, good to see you.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes, but we'll see you tomorrow.